Chloe Walker made a list of every reason she couldn't fall for her boss. Every logical, sensible, self-preserving reason. She thought writing it down would help. She thought seeing it in black and white would make the feeling go away. She was wrong, and when Dylan Mitchell found that list, everything changed. If you're enjoying this, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Chloe had been Dylan Mitchell's executive assistant for 8 months, and in that time, she'd learned to read him the way some people read weather patterns. The slight tension in his jaw before a difficult call, the way his left hand always went to his watch when he was buying time to think, the barely perceptible shift in his tone when someone was wasting his time. She'd also learned, much to her own frustration, that he was devastatingly attractive in a way that had nothing to do with the obvious things. Yes, he was tall, dark-haired, with the kind of sharp jawline that belonged on magazine covers. Yes, he wore suits that probably cost more than her monthly rent, but it was the other things that got under her skin. The way he listened, actually listened, when she spoke. The rare moments when he smiled, really smiled, and the entire energy of a room shifted. The intelligence that radiated off him like heat, which was exactly why she'd made the list. It had been a Tuesday afternoon. Dylan was in back-to-back meetings, and Chloe had found herself alone in the small executive break room with her notebook and too much coffee. She'd titled it simply, Pros and Cons of Dating My Boss. The pros came easily, too easily, brilliant, funny when he lets his guard down, remembers things I mention in passing, makes me feel seen, the way he says my name, that thing he does with his sleeves when he's thinking, those eyes. She'd stopped herself there, cheeks warm, and forced herself to the cons. Never demonstrates interest beyond professional. Doesn't share anything personal. Workaholic. Emotionally unavailable. Never looks at me like a woman, just like an employee. Would ruin my career. Would ruin everything. The cons won. They had to. She'd torn the page out, folded it once, and slipped it into her planner, telling herself that was the end of it. A momentary lapse. A harmless way to process an inconvenient attraction. 3 days later, she'd left the planner on the conference room table after a particularly brutal strategy session. She'd realized it 10 minutes later, heart-sinking, and rushed back. Dylan was still there, standing by the windows, her planner open in his hands. Their eyes met across the room. Chloe's stomach dropped. She couldn't tell from his expression what he'd seen, but the way he carefully closed the planner and set it on the table, the deliberate neutrality of his movements told her everything. He'd read it. "You forgot this," he said, voice even, professionally courteous. "Thank you," Chloe managed, crossing the room on legs that felt unsteady. She picked up the planner, not looking inside, not checking if the list was still there. It didn't matter. The damage was done. Dylan said nothing else. Didn't acknowledge what he'd seen. Didn't mention it when she brought him coffee the next morning or during the afternoon briefing, or at any point in the following week. But things changed anyway. Small things at first, almost imperceptible. On Monday, he'd asked how her weekend was, not the perfunctory version he used with everyone, but an actual question, with follow-up, with genuine interest in her answer. On Tuesday, he'd rescheduled a late meeting without explanation, telling her she should go home at a reasonable hour for once. By Friday, Chloe was starting to wonder if she was imagining things, and then he'd complimented her. Not her work, her. The way she'd styled her hair differently. It was brief, casual, delivered in passing, but it landed like a physical touch. Chloe stood at her desk after he'd walked away, pulse racing, mind spinning. Dylan Mitchell didn't compliment anyone's hair. Dylan Mitchell barely noticed when people changed their entire wardrobes, unless he was paying attention. Really paying attention. She pulled out her planner that night, alone in her apartment, and reread the list. The cons stared back at her, each one a wall she'd built between them. Never looks at me like a woman, just like an employee, doesn't share anything personal, never demonstrates interest beyond professional. Chloe closed her eyes, remembering the way he'd looked at her that afternoon when he mentioned her hair. The warmth in his voice when he'd asked about her weekend. The deliberate thoughtfulness of giving her Friday evening back. It couldn't be, could it? She told herself she was reading too much into professional courtesy. Dylan was just being a better boss, more human, more approachable. It had nothing to do with the list. The following Monday, Dylan asked her to join him for a site visit to one of his tech company's new development facilities in Redwood City. The surprise came 15 minutes into the drive, when he asked about her family. Not in the generic networking way people asked questions they didn't care about. He asked where she'd grown up, what her parents did, if she had siblings, and when Chloe answered, tentatively at first, then with growing ease, he listened the way he listened in board meetings, fully present, absorbing every detail. She learned things, too, that he'd grown up in Seattle, that his father had been a naval engineer, that he'd taught himself to code at 12 because he was bored in summer school. Small pieces of a life he'd never shared before. By the time they reached Redwood City, something had shifted. The air between them felt different, less formal, more human. The facility tour took 2 hours. Dylan was in his element, sharp, focused, asking questions that made engineers nervous and excited in equal measure. Chloe took notes, managed logistics, kept everything running smoothly. It was familiar territory. But then there was a moment, brief and electric, when they were standing side by side reviewing blueprints spread across a conference table. Dylan leaned closer to point out something on the design, and his shoulder brushed hers. It was nothing. Accidental contact in a crowded room, except he didn't move away, neither did she. The warmth of his proximity seemed to intensify every sound, every breath. Chloe's pulse kicked up. She forced herself to focus on the blueprints, on the engineer's explanation, on anything except the fact that Dylan Mitchell was standing close enough that she could smell his cologne, something subtle and expensive that made her want to lean in rather than away. When the meeting finally ended and they headed back to the car, Chloe felt wound tight, hyper-aware of every movement, every glance. The drive back started in comfortable silence. Then Dylan spoke, his voice quieter than usual. He told her she'd been invaluable today, that the engineers respected her, that she had good instincts, that he trusted her judgment more than most of his senior staff. Chloe thanked him, trying to sound professional, but her voice came out softer than intended. Dylan glanced at her just for a second before returning his eyes to the road, and in that glance, Chloe saw something she'd convinced herself she'd imagined: interest. Real, unmistakable interest. Her stomach flipped. She thought about the list, about the con that said he never looked at her like a woman, about how fundamentally wrong that felt now. They stopped for coffee at a small place off Highway 101, the kind of spot that clearly wasn't on any billionaire's usual route. Dylan ordered black coffee. Chloe got a latte. They sat in the car in the parking lot, windows cracked, late afternoon sun slanting through the windshield. Dylan asked what she did outside of work, what she read, what she listened to, where she went when she needed to think, questions that had nothing to do with quarterly reports or investor meetings. Chloe answered honestly. She told him about the bookstore in North Beach she visited every Sunday, about her terrible attempts at learning to surf, about the playlist she made for long drives. He smiled at that last part, a real smile, the rare kind that transformed his entire face. Then he told her he'd noticed she always wore the same silver bracelet. Simple, delicate, slightly worn. He wanted to know the story. Chloe's breath caught. She'd worn that bracelet every single day for 3 years. It had been her grandmother's. She'd never mentioned it to anyone at work. The fact that he'd noticed, that he'd remembered, that he'd cared enough to ask, it undid something in her chest. She explained, voice quieter now, about her grandmother, about the bracelet, about why she never took it off. Dylan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said simply that he understood. That some things mattered more than their monetary value. The moment stretched between them, intimate and unguarded. Chloe realized with sudden clarity that this wasn't just him being a better boss. This was something else entirely. Something intentional and dangerous, and impossible to ignore. When they finally pulled into the garage at Mitchell Technologies headquarters, the sun was setting, casting everything in gold and shadow. Dylan turned off the engine but didn't immediately move to get out. Instead, he looked at her directly, holding her gaze in the dimming light. He told her he'd enjoyed today. Not the meeting. Today. With her. Chloe's heart hammered against her ribs. She managed to say she had too. The silence that followed felt enormous, charged, like standing at the edge of something with no clear way back. Dylan reached for the door handle, breaking the moment, but not before Chloe saw the conflict flash across his face. The same conflict she felt. Want. Battling against every reason why this was a terrible idea. As they walked into the building together, professional distance restored, Chloe knew with absolute certainty that the list didn't matter anymore. The cons were disappearing one by one, and she had no idea what to do about it. The shift became impossible to deny after Seattle. Dylan had a 2-day conference with potential investors, and he'd asked Chloe to come along. Standard protocol. Except nothing about the trip felt standard. They flew commercial first class. His private jet was in maintenance, which meant sitting side by side for 2.5 hours with nothing but a narrow armrest between them. Dylan worked on his laptop for the first hour, but then he closed it and asked Chloe about the book she'd mentioned during their drive back from Redwood City. She'd been reading it on her phone during takeoff. He'd noticed. Of course he had. They talked about books, then movies, then the specific kind of terrible television they both secretly loved. Dylan admitted he'd binge-watched an entire season of a cooking competition show in one weekend. Chloe laughed, actually laughed, and the sound made him smile in that rare, unguarded way that did dangerous things to her composure. Somewhere over Idaho, their arms brushed on the shared armrest. Neither of them moved away. The contact was minimal, just fabric against fabric, the warmth of proximity, but Chloe felt it like a current running beneath her skin. The hotel in Seattle was downtown, sleek and modern with views of Elliott Bay. Separate rooms naturally, but on the same floor. Close enough that Chloe was hyper-aware of Dylan's presence even through walls and distance. The first day of meetings went smoothly. Chloe managed schedules, handled logistics, kept Dylan's coffee exactly how he liked it. Professional, efficient, exactly what she was paid to do. But that evening, after the formal dinner with investors ended and everyone dispersed, Dylan suggested a walk. The Seattle waterfront wasn't far, and the night was clear. Chloe should have said no, should have cited exhaustion or work to prepare for tomorrow. Instead, she found herself walking beside him along the pier, city lights reflecting off dark water, the air cool and sharp with salt. They talked easily now, the way people do when pretense has started to crack. Dylan told her about living here as a kid, about the summer he'd spent working on the docks before college, about how the smell of the ocean still made him feel like himself in a way nothing else did. Chloe shared things too. Small truths she normally kept private, the way she missed her grandmother most on Sundays, how she sometimes drove to the coast just to sit in her car and watch the waves, how she'd always felt more comfortable in motion than standing still. At some point during the walk, Dylan's hand brushed hers. Not accidental this time, deliberate, testing. Chloe's breath caught, but she didn't pull away. They stopped near the end of the pier, the city sprawling behind them, water endless ahead. Dylan turned to face her, and the look in his eyes was different from anything she'd seen before. Vulnerable, uncertain, human. He told her he needed to be honest about something, that the last few weeks hadn't been random, that he'd been trying to show her something, to prove something, and he wasn't sure if she'd noticed. Chloe's heart hammered. She told him she'd noticed every single thing. The silence stretched between them, loaded with everything they hadn't said. Dylan stepped closer, close enough that Chloe had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze, close enough that she could see the conflict playing across his face, want versus restraint, desire versus consequence. He asked, voice low, if she knew what he was trying not to do right now. Chloe's pulse thundered in her ears. She did know. She felt it too. The magnetic pull, the ache of proximity without contact, the desperate want to close the final distance between them. But they were still in Seattle on a business trip, still boss and assistant, still standing on the edge of a line that, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. Dylan's jaw tightened. He stepped back, creating space that felt like a physical loss. He said they should get back to the hotel. Early morning tomorrow. Chloe nodded, not trusting her voice. They walked back in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged, electric, full of things they both wanted and couldn't quite allow themselves to take. At the hotel, they stopped outside Chloe's room. Dylan stood closer than necessary, one hand braced against the wall beside her door. He looked at her with an intensity that made her skin flush. He told her good night, but his eyes said something entirely different. Chloe went inside and closed the door, leaning against it, heart racing. She could still feel the phantom warmth of his hand brushing hers. could still see the raw want in his expression. She pulled out her phone and opened the Notes app, found the old list, read through the cons that had once seemed so absolute. Never looks at me like a woman. Wrong. Doesn't share anything personal. Wrong. Emotionally unavailable. Increasingly, definitively wrong. Chloe deleted the list. All of it. Pros and cons both. Because the truth was simpler and more terrifying than any list could capture. She wanted Dylan Mitchell, and he wanted her back. The only question left was what they were going to do about it. They flew back to San Francisco the next afternoon, and the tension between them had become something tangible. Something that lived in the space between words, in the way Dylan's gaze lingered a fraction too long, in the careful way Chloe avoided touching him, even accidentally. The week that followed was torture of the sweetest kind. Dylan continued his silent campaign. Fresh flowers appeared on Chloe's desk every Monday without explanation. He remembered she took her coffee with oat milk and always had one waiting when she arrived. Small gestures that said everything he wasn't saying out loud, but there were cracks forming in his restraint. Chloe could see them. The way his hand would move toward her during meetings, then stop. The millisecond pause before he stepped back when they were standing too close. The tension in his shoulders when other men in the office talked to her. It came to a head on a Thursday evening. Most of the office had cleared out by 7. Chloe was finishing quarterly reports in the small executive break room when Dylan found her. He'd loosened his tie, rolled his sleeves up. He looked tired and unfairly attractive. He asked if she wanted to grab dinner. Nothing fancy, just food, because neither of them had eaten and it was getting late. Chloe knew it was a terrible idea, knew exactly where this was heading, said yes anyway. They went to a quiet Italian place in North Beach, the kind of neighborhood spot that didn't care about reservations or who you were. They sat in a corner booth, and for the first time there was no pretense of this being work-related. This was a date. They both knew it. Dylan asked about her family again, but different questions this time. What made her happy? What she wanted that she didn't have yet? What scared her? Chloe answered honestly. Too honestly. The wine helped, but it was more than that. She was tired of pretending, tired of the careful distance. She told him she was scared of wanting things she shouldn't want, of the way certain situations could change everything and there'd be no going back. Dylan set down his wine glass, his eyes never leaving hers. He said he understood that fear intimately, that he'd been living with it for weeks. The air between them shifted, heated. Chloe asked, voice barely above a whisper, what happened with the list, if he'd really read it. Dylan didn't pretend not to know what she meant. He admitted he had, said he'd read every word and that it had kept him awake that entire night, that seeing himself through her eyes, understanding what she saw in him and what she didn't, had changed something fundamental. He told her the cons had felt like a challenge, a roadmap of exactly what he needed to change to become the man she might actually want, not just the boss she worked for. Chloe's breath caught. She asked if that's what this had all been. The conversations, the attention, the gradual dismantling of every wall between them. Dylan reached across the table and took her hand. The first real, intentional touch. His fingers were warm, slightly rough, and the contact sent electricity straight through her. He said yes, all of it, every single thing, because she'd been right about who he was, and wrong about who he could be. They left the restaurant an hour later, the meal barely touched. Dylan's hand stayed on the small of Chloe's back as they walked to his car, the touch burning through the thin fabric of her blouse. He drove them to his place without asking, a modern house in Pacific Heights with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay. Chloe had been there once before for a work emergency, but this felt entirely different. Inside, Dylan poured them both water neither of them drank. They stood in his living room, the city lights sprawling below, and the restraint that had held for weeks finally, irrevocably, shattered. Dylan crossed the distance between them in 2 strides. He cupped her face in both hands, searching her eyes for any hesitation. Chloe reached up, her fingers curling into his shirt, pulling him closer. He asked if she was sure, if she understood what this meant, what they'd be crossing. She told him she'd never been more sure of anything. Dylan kissed her then, slow at first, almost reverent, then deeper as weeks of restraint caught fire. His hands moved to her waist, pulling her against him. Chloe's fingers threaded through his hair, and the small sound she made seemed to undo the last of his control. They stumbled backward toward the couch, mouths never separating, hands exploring with desperate urgency. Dylan's tie came off. Chloe's blouse became untucked. Every touch was electric, necessary, inevitable. He pulled back just enough to look at her, breathing hard, eyes dark with want. He told her they could stop, that if this was too fast, if she needed time, he would wait. Chloe answered by kissing him again, harder this time, her body pressed fully against his. There was no more waiting, no more lists, no more reasons why this was impossible. Just them, finally giving in to what they'd both wanted from the beginning. The night blurred into something timeless. Dylan and Chloe moved from the living room to his bedroom, the city lights below casting silver patterns across the walls. Every touch was deliberate, exploratory, charged with weeks of restraint finally breaking free. They learned each other slowly, then urgently, bodies speaking a language that needed no words. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, Chloe's head on Dylan's chest, his fingers tracing absent patterns on her shoulder. The silence was comfortable, full, the kind that only exists between people who've finally stopped hiding. Dylan spoke first, his voice rough and quiet. He told her this changed everything, that he couldn't go back to pretending she was just his assistant, couldn't unsee what he felt, couldn't undo what they'd just done. Chloe lifted her head to look at him. She said she didn't want to go back, that she'd been pretending for months and it had nearly killed her. He smiled then, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. He asked what they were supposed to do now, how they were supposed to navigate this at work in front of everyone, when all he wanted was to keep her exactly like this. Chloe thought about it for a moment, then told him the truth, that she couldn't be his assistant anymore. Not like this, that it wouldn't be fair to either of them or to the team. Dylan's expression shifted, something like panic flickering across his features. He asked if she was quitting. She told him no, but that things had to change. Roles, boundaries, the entire dynamic, because she refused to be the woman who slept her way into keeping a job, and he deserved better than the ethical nightmare of dating a direct report. Dylan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he'd been thinking about the same thing, that he'd actually already started making arrangements, hoping they'd get here eventually. There was a senior strategy position opening up, reporting to the CFO instead of him. More responsibility, better pay, complete independence. He told her it was hers if she wanted it, not because of this, but because she'd earned it 10 times over. Chloe's throat tightened. She asked when he'd started planning that. Dylan admitted it had been the day after he found the list, that he'd known even then where this was heading, what he wanted, what it would require. He'd just needed time to get everything in place, to prove to her and to himself that this was real. Chloe kissed him then, slow and deep, tasting salt and certainty. When they broke apart, she told him she'd take the position, that she wanted this, wanted him, wanted the messy, complicated, beautiful reality of whatever they were becoming. Dylan pulled her closer, his arms secure around her. He said they'd figure it out together. The office politics, the inevitable gossip, the raised eyebrows and whispered speculation. None of it mattered as much as this. The sky was starting to lighten outside, dawn breaking soft and pink over the bay. Chloe realized they'd been awake all night, talking and touching and rewriting every assumption they'd held about what was possible between them. Dylan noticed her watching the sunrise. He asked what she was thinking. She told him she was thinking about the list, about how wrong she'd been, and how grateful she was to be wrong. He laughed quietly, pressing a kiss to her temple. He said he still had it, actually, the original. He'd kept it in his desk drawer as a reminder. Chloe asked what it reminded him of. Dylan's answer was simple and devastating, that he was capable of change, that the right person made him want to be better, that love, when it mattered, was worth the risk. Chloe's heart expanded in her chest. She whispered that she loved him too. So what did you think? Rate this story from 1 to 10 and leave your answer in the comments below. A new chapter is coming soon. Don't miss it. Bye-bye.